All right, welcome everyone. We are live. It is November 11th, 2020. We are joining you for a special Veterans Day version of our Greece 200 panel in conjunction with the Sons of Pericles. This is the third and final part of our How the Regions Won the Revolution series. As we've discussed before, the entire year of Greece 200, we will be discussing various topics on how the revolution unfolded, its impact on the West, how the West impacted the revolution, vice versa, different people and regions that were involved. So this is the final part where we go around different regions and discuss how each of them contributed. I want to take out the time, since it is Veterans Day, to thank all of our veterans who are either currently serving or have served already in the armed forces. I hope that I think my panelists can agree as well, I hope that as we cover some of these topics, we keep in mind that the revolutionaries that we are discussing are kind of being formed in the people that we see today and the veterans that we see today. They're upholding American soil and upholding American values, and a lot of times those are shared with Hellenic values. And so I think we do this really in honor of our veterans. I would say we would dedicate this panel today to our veterans, and hopefully this is a way that we can celebrate them and their sacrifices for our country and for our people. So without further ado, I will go ahead and introduce the panelists. Of course, I will be moderating as co-chair of Greece 200 Committee and the chair of the Sons of Pericles Cultural Committee. We have with us three panelists. We have first George Kaplanidis. He's a 20-year-old junior political science major and innovation minor at the University of Florida. He is a Sons of Pericles member and has previously interned for Congressman Gus Bilirakis, interned in the White House, and has worked in various capacities for presidential campaigns. He is the current District 2 District Marshal, and he is passionate about combining his love for politics, Greek heritage, and foreign policy through his involvement in the Sons of Pericles and the AHEPA family. We have also Tyler Shanahan. He is a former Lieutenant Governor for District 2 from 2017 to 2018, and he is currently the broadcast and production coordinator for a think tank in Washington, D.C., and he is an alumnus of Florida State University. Finally, we have Alec Economakis. He is a member of the Sons of Pericles and the current Supreme Governor of North America for Sons of Pericles. After a stint as chapter president of Tallahassee and really keeping that chapter alive at a time where I think half the chapter graduated at the same time, and Alec and his contingent was able to keep it alive in a very difficult transition period. He then moved on now with his passion, now that he's living in Washington, D.C., to serve on the Supreme Lodge. He's graduated from FSU with a master's in applied economics and is currently looking to start a career as a data analyst back in the greater D.C. area. So welcome to all of you. Thank you for participating, and I hope we can have some good conversation tonight. So without further ado, Alec, we'll kick it off to you. Again, as we've done before in our past presentations, we want to set the stage, build up some context for exactly what we'll be covering. So we're discussing Mani and Laconia. I will preface our conversation with this. We are calling this Mani and Laconia. As much as we try, though, it is impossible to separate Mani and Laconia from the rest of Peloponneso. So we will be discussing predominantly those regions, but of course, Peloponneso was so intertwined, more so than other regions, and so much activity happened there that a lot of this conversation will discuss the entire Peloponneso region, but with a particular focus on the Mani Peninsula and the region of Laconia. So with that being said, Alec, where is the Mani Peninsula located? The regions of Laconia and Messenia, where are they located within the country of Greece?
So thank you, Paul, for having me here. All three regions are located in the south peninsulas of the Peloponnese. So the Mani Peninsula is in the central south peninsula of the Peloponnese, and the Messenian and Laconian regions consist of the rest of the southern part of Greece. The Messenian region, notably, has a lot of mountainous terrains, notably the Taygetus, the Kyparitsia, and the Lykodimo in the southwest. All these regions around here are mountainous, rocky terrains, both bordering the sea.
So expound a little bit, I guess, on, we know where it is now. The geography of it. What is the terrain? What's the topography? What does it look like from a natural perspective?
The terrain is arid rock, bare pointed mountains. They're all separated by deep chasms. There was superstition that Mani itself held the entrance to Tartarus, hell in ancient Greek religion. Essentially, it's only accessible by land through one point, as it being a peninsula. It provided a tactical advantage of defense for Maniots as well, but mostly a rough, bare, mountainous terrain.
And Tyler, I know we were talking a little bit about, I know Alec kind of mentioned it, but the geography, the terrain, what did that mean for military strategy, the geopolitical strategy of Mani Peninsula? Can you expound on that a little bit?
Sure. Well, I mean, similar to, I would say other conflicts, the Greeks had the home field advantage. The Maniots had the home field advantage. They knew the terrain, and it was exceptionally rough. There was really only few points of entrance for the Ottomans at that point to engage in any conflict, and bringing any kind of major military forces through the very, very rough terrain, the mountains, the deep chasms, as Alec mentioned, proved extremely, extremely difficult. But, as we'll see through battles that we discuss later on in this discussion, this terrain proved very, very difficult for the Ottomans.
And one thing I'd just like to add, based on conversations we've had on our past panels, is this was really facilitated as well by the help of the islands in their naval warfare and being able to protect really the Aegean. Because as you said, Tyler, Mani is a peninsula, so there's only one point to enter by land, and they couldn't enter by sea either because Hydrospetsus, Psara, their fire ships, their naval forces were able to keep a lot of Ottoman forces at bay and prevent them, by and large, from making landfall via the Aegean. So even more so, all the more reason why Mani Peninsula, I think, was incredibly strategic. We'll see, later on in the conversation how that came to unfold when it came to certain naval battles and those interrelationships. But it's just an interesting note how already we see these things kind of relate together. So that's the location, that's the geography, that's where we're talking about. But Tyler, I'll come back to you. Who are the people there? What kind of demographic are we looking at? Can you describe the Maniotes and their culture?
Well, like many other people in Greece, the Maniotes were an extremely proud people. They're said to be descended from Sclavonian tribes who dwelt on either side of the Aegitus. They are of pure Grecian origin, and their language is thought to have come from ancient Greeks. Interestingly enough, too, it is said that Maniotes are actually part descendant from Spartans who did move south from Thermopylae several years, hundreds of years earlier. But I think more interesting is that most Maniots were practiced warriors, given the infighting that they had a lot of times, but also to say that this really wasn't their first rodeo when it came to the revolution. And as we'll touch on a little bit later, we actually find that generationally, there was a lot of conflict passed down from families that proved useful in the start of the Greek Revolution.
So interestingly enough, in this case, I guess their infighting and their kind of internal disagreements actually prepared them for the real thing later on down the road.
Sure.
So I mean, those are the people, but there was a whole society, of course, at that time formed, and we want to try to paint a full picture. So those are the kind of people and demographics of the people in Mani, but we also kind of want to delve into, and I think, George, you can maybe discuss this, the economics and political environment leading up to the revolution in Mani. I know we heard when we were discussing Macedonia and Hydra in past weeks that they had thriving commerce, thriving maritime trade. Part of that as a result of the Treaty of Kinarji, which was coming from the Russo-Turkish Wars. And so with that in mind, what kind of environment economically, politically, culturally was in Mani at that time leading up to 1821?
Yes, thanks for having me, Paul, again. But this is very similar to the other regions discussed and presented on before. Mani had an abundance of exports, in this case, silk and oils. Their desire to avoid heavy taxation from the Turks is one of the key reasons they revolted and started the overall greater Greek Revolution. But this trade and commerce allowed the Mani people to have great relationships and almost like treaties and agreements with different parts of the greater Greek country and outside influences with other countries and nations. Many credit the Olav Revolt as a precursor to the Greek Revolution. This event was a large catalyst in convincing Greeks that Turkish oppression and intolerable taxes and public corruptions were unjust and actions must be taken. Greek nationalism spread as a result of these attacks, which were brought upon by the Ottomans, and the Peloponnesian citizens began to back one another in agreement that Turks and Greeks have an irreplaceable relationship. So these basically human rights violations or early human right violations were being noticed by not only Mani citizens and the greater Greek population, but outside countries and influences that will be discussed later on. It is well regarded that this revolt was a catalyst for motivating the French to stage their own revolution, and many Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire's ideas stemmed directly from early Greece and started their own country's revolt based on Greek democracy and the values of early Greek thinkers. As Tyler mentioned, the Maniotes were a proud people and proud of their Greek origin and fierce warriors. Their involvement with the Philiki Eteria will give them a strong sense of Hellenism and will be discussed a little later in the presentation.
So really, I think every region probably can attest to that, but really in Mani, it seems like we see this strong sense of Hellenism, this Greek nationalism that after 400 years of Ottoman occupation, we still look back to our ancient ancestors with a desire to preserve and grow the Hellenic values that they fostered and created. So I think that's well said, George, and we'll see how that unfolds, of course. But understanding those catalysts, of course, is important because a little bit we kind of think the same way today, right? Our desire to promote and preserve Hellenism is what leads us to do what we do, and that's, while on a much less sacrificial scale, exactly what the revolutionaries of 1821 had in mind when they sacrificed their lives and livelihoods for independence. So leading up to the revolution, right, there were obviously things before 1821. It didn't happen automatically or without precursors. There were events and people, developments that led up to the revolution to allow us to set the stage for the outbreak in 1821. So Tyler, Russia specifically, I know, had some early influences. Can you get into a little bit about Russia and its involvement early on, well before the actual revolution took place?
Absolutely. So, going back to what I was saying before, the Maniots were no stranger to conflict at this point. It was in the late 1800s that Catherine the Great established this Greek plan, where she wanted to expand the Russian Empire into the Peloponnese. And so she effectively sent a number of Russian troops led by Alexei Orlov, which was later known as the Orlov Revolution or Orlov Rebellion, to help gain the influence of the Peloponnesians and the Maniots there. And they did start trying to fight the Turks. Ultimately, it did not come to fruition. There was a revolt. The revolt actually was ultimately abandoned after there was an Albanian retaliation, and they ransacked Tripoli. And it seemed like the plan certainly did not come to fruition for Catherine the Great, but it did instill this influence among the Maniots there, if it didn't already exist, that, hey, maybe we can redefine what it means to be independent. It instilled this influence early on that there is a fighting chance for us to take on the Ottomans there. And like I mentioned before, this is largely generational. The Eastern Spartan Legion, which was one of the fighting groups in this Orlov rebellion, was actually led by Yorios Mavromichalis, which, funny enough, was the grandfather of Petro Mavromichalis, who obviously, as we continue to talk about this, was a centerpiece in the start of the Greek Revolution.
And also the father in between, Yorios' son and Petrobey's father, was also involved in the Orlov revolt, though not necessarily a leader. So three generations of the Mavromichalis clan at least, fighting to defend Hellenism, fighting to promote Greece and the independent and create the independent state of Greece.
Absolutely.
You say that well, Tyler. I personally, I've also read some accounts, and maybe it's a little more cynical of a view, but the Orlov revolt, they inspired, but at the same time, it can also be seen that they were there when things were good, and they were hoping to get the Greeks on their side against the Ottomans. And then when things got tough, they bailed very quickly. So there's a little bit of a more cynical view to that I guess historians will disagree on. But
I mean,
either way, definitely influential regardless.
I think that in itself, though, is even more, proof isn't the right word, but it goes to show that it was even more impressive that, they quickly left when things got tough. And then years later, they came together and attempted to do the same thing. And, obviously now looking 200 years back on it, we're ultimately very successful in doing so. So for whatever that's worth.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Optimistic and probably a bright side to any sort of negative influences it may have had, right? So, that was obviously, we're talking 1790s at then. We still have 30 years between then, though, and 1821. So getting a little bit closer then, Alec, before the war itself begins, you have a few years before where you start seeing these plans laid, these preparations starting before actual revolutionary activity begins. So can you describe the planning and preparation that led up to 1821 and the years earlier?
Yes, I essentially call these the seeds that were sowed together to sort of stage this whole rebellion. Essentially, a group in Odessa, Ukraine, known as the Filiki Eteria, meaning the Society of Friends, was created by three merchants to discuss their grievances with Ottoman rule. Now, it's noted that while this wasn't made in Greece, this has a diaspora initiative for those who were from Greece to help fight for their home. So they didn't have much background, many members, until about a decade later, when many other Greeks, notably in Constantinople and the Peloponnese, especially some Maniots as well, started joining the Brotherhood. And that's when the headway started coming that maybe a rebellion was feasible. It was actually able to happen. They moved to Constantinople, to the heart of Orthodoxy, and started gaining their members. And as the years passed, we had famous Maniot leaders like Petrobe Mavromichalis, as Tyler mentioned, and even Theodoros Kolokotronis joining the Filiki Eteria, which I thought was a great catalyst and precursor for the war.
Excuse me, I'm on mute. And I think even closer, we get to a point where there's agreements even signed, right? Which is kind of interesting. And you bring up Kolokotroni and Mavromichali. Can you kind of introduce them as people and kind of discuss who they were? And we'll discuss their contributions later on. But who were these people?
Yes, Theodoros Kolokotronis was an orphan who lived a bandit life with his uncle at the age of 15. He was a cleft at heart, so he considered Greece to be the birthplace of civilization, and he hated Ottoman rule. He also played a huge role in the whole revolution. He's the pride of Mani, that's whom he fought for, and as well as the Peloponnese in a mostly fractured area. So he believed in independence for all of Greece and fought to see it through. In fact, Petrobe Mavromichalis, who was a Maniot leader at the time, actually had Kolokotronis at his house and let him stay with him in the 1821. But as you mentioned earlier, agreements under the table, there was one notably in 1819, the Kythrias Agreement. At the home of Petrobe Mavromichalis, he gathered powerful chieftains, leaders of Mani and Laconia to discuss plans that were in line with the Filikieteria, which they had joined prior. And that was sort of another catalyst that helped progress this sort of thought that maybe we could go for war. So yes, Petrobe, Mavro Michalis, and Theodoros Kolokotronis, they were very, very well-known people in Mani history. And Petrobe actually was a huge role in getting this whole moved, especially hosting the Kythrias agreement at his house.
So we kind of almost have a little bit of a perfect storm here, right? And I think, as you said, Kolokotroni and Mavro Michali end up meeting January 1821. As George mentioned, we have this strong sense of Hellenism and nationalism building up. Resources are becoming gathered a little bit. And then what we see a little bit after Kolokotroni arrives, can you talk a little bit about kind of, I know in the north, keep in mind at this time, Ali Pasha is rebelling in Epirus. How did that affect Peloponneso? Because I know there was some early influence there and kind of catalyzed a few things maybe for the Greek forces.
Yes, as Ali Pasha got ready to defend in the north, that left the southwestern peninsula of Greece, especially Kalamata, most notably, Messenia, to be very vulnerable to attack. So this was proven a great time of advantage for the Greeks to actually revolt and to start something, to sort of rise the troops. It's actually fantastic you noted that.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I guess desire met opportunity at the right time, and I know there's even some documents that discuss the revolution wasn't necessarily supposed to start yet. I believe the Filikieteria actually had a later date in mind, but the Maniotes are an impatient people, and the opportunity presented itself. And looking back 2020, I think it worked out well. But so we get then powder kegs has started, revolution begins. George, how did the revolution begin? What was the initial outbreak?
So on March 17th, 1821, and which is, I don't know if you want to call it ironic or symbolic, the city of war, Ariopoli, then capital of Mani, the Maniotes chose this place to fight against the Ottomans and become the first region in Greece to call for revolution. So when you talked about the powder keg or the spark that really inspired and gave the drive to all of Greece to revolt against their oppressors, this is the perfect place and the perfect time to do so and fight against all these human rights and civil violations or atrocities committed by the Turks. This was done because the elite class of leaders, all whom were ironically appointed by the Turks, urged the city's leader Petrobe Mavro Michalis to declare war, and the Maniotes chieftains gathered in the city known as Ariopoli today and aired their grievances of the Ottoman suppression with one another. And I would also like to say, and I think it was mentioned before, that Mavro Michali had two sons who were taken hostage by the Turks. So for a father to have so much pride and faith in his country and this war and revolution to sacrifice his own sons is something that hasn't been taken lightly and can almost serve as an inspiration for young Greeks in the diaspora to continue this fight to the modern day and to the future.
Yeah, I think that's well said, and it's interesting when you know the risks that were taken, right? You can't make sacrifice without risk. There has to be something that you're sacrificing, and the ultimate sacrifice in this case was, of course, Mavro Michalis was willing to sacrifice not only his life, but the lives of his two sons, which were, it wasn't hypothetical, they were actually hostages of the Ottoman Empire at the time. We know from later on that one survived and one did not. But the fact that he even contemplated taking on that risk really does show his pride for his country, his faith in the establishment of an independent Greek state. And I agree, George, definitely not something to be taken lightly. And I guess as a follow-up, because you mentioned, March 17th, they march from Ariopoli. They start the revolution at Ariopoli, march to Kalamata, and we'll discuss a little bit later the liberation of Kalamata. But in parallel to that, what we know really before we look into it, what we know, I think, as a Hellenic people and as the diaspora and community, is that March 25th, Zito y Helada, that's when the revolution began, right? So can you explain a little bit of the interplay between those two dates and what was going on? I mean, there's about a week difference there between those two starting dates. Could you kind of describe that a little bit, what the stage was like?
Yes. So, like you said, depending who you ask, or historians are gonna argue back and forth. March 17th at Areopoli with the Maniotes, that can be described as, the powder keg, but also a week later, March 25th, same year, 1821, where at a monastery, Greek priests raised the first, Greek flag, and called for revolution. Then, both of those times and locations and events can be taken to contributing factors to the start of the Greek Revolution. And it's awesome that they weren't too far apart, because historians would, like to argue which one was which, but within a couple days they're able to decipher that these two events had great impact to the founding of Greece as a nation.
And it's interesting, I guess, why we bring up Mani particularly is because if that's the case, then it really did catalyze revolutionary activity in the rest of Peloponnese, and kind of serve as the real sort of beginning and one of the influencing factors that led the rest of Peloponnese and the area around it to take up arms against the Ottoman Empire. So we have they've declared war in Areopoli. Alec, do you want to discuss kind of their trek into Kalamata and how that played out from the Greek perspective?
Yes. So once the decision to declare war was made, it was followed by quick plans to move up to Kalamata and liberate the city from Ottoman forces. This was led by Petrobe Mavromichalis and 2,000 Maniots that he had come with him. And within 2 days, they were outside the city walls and eventually ransacked the city and liberated it from Ottoman rule. Greeks threw shots, threw rocks, heckled, cursed at all the Turks while they were trying to rile them up and get back to the city walls. Now, this win I thought was monumental because it helped create the Mycenaean state in Greece. Although it was great for Greece, the Ottomans started to get suspicious. And while they were able to secretly rile up and get more troops in Mani to revolt, the Pasha began to be suspicious. And notably, he actually summoned all the beys from around the area to discuss how they would suppress this Greek revolt. Interestingly enough, Petrobe Mavromichalis feigned an illness and sent his son as a sort of form of good communication that he couldn't come, to keep this secret and help bide more time for Greece.
So, George, I want to kind of ask you then, at this point now that we've established when the revolution started, from a military perspective, what kind of warfare was being used or was prominent by the Greek forces around this time?
So the main types of warfare that was being used was guerrilla and hit and run tactics. This is because, as mentioned and described before, Mani has a very mountainous and rugged terrain. It's not easy to for a foreign power to come and set up base camp and know the terrain. So the local Maniotes had a home field advantage, and they were able to hit quick the Turks and retreat into the mountains. These people were known as kleftes, and they were very instrumental in fighting and ultimately winning against a larger, more equipped and prepared force of Turks. They would also sing songs from the Thudios, a nationalistic book of poems written decades ago, and hurled rocks and insults between gunshots and fires to both entertain each other and enrage the Turks. These tactics were, perfected and started in Greece thousands of years ago, and we could see that they have been used throughout various revolutions and revolts across the world, because usually the population being oppressed does not have the time to prepare, the time to train soldiers, and the time to build up arms. So these guerrilla hit and run tactics really maximize the effectiveness of the interaction.
And so you mentioned a little bit kind of the location of where these battles took place, the altitude advantages. With that being said, was there any sort of battles within Mani itself? Because I know we talk a little bit about the area around Mani, but getting into the Mani Peninsula, did any of the fighting actually take place within that peninsula?
Not exactly. Mani was not particularly host to many battles during the revolution. In the first years of the war, only a few Turks occupied forts in Meora and places like Patra, Goroni, and Methoni. The Muslim Albanian clans of Raduni once occupied its northeastern borders, but quickly retreated north in response to an outbreak of the war. However, Maniotes were involved in much of the fighting, most notably evident by a total loss of family members. As mentioned before, Peretobe Mavromichali had a loss of 49 members to his greater family as a result of the fighting.
Yeah, and no question their involvement, and like you said, the sacrifice that the Mavromichali clan was willing to undertake and ended up undertaking. But Tyler, this is a little bit reminiscent of what you were saying earlier about the geostrategy kind of Mani and how it created a really natural fortress that was very difficult, if not impossible, for Ottomans to penetrate. So we see that now kind of coming to fruition. And I guess, Tyler, I'll actually kick it over to you. So, in all fairness, we discuss Ottoman atrocities a lot. So let's discuss, something that we're probably not so proud of, the siege and massacre of Tripolitsa, summer of 1821. What happened, circumstances surrounding it?
Sure. Well, the siege of Tripolitsa itself was hugely necessary for the Greeks at that point. It was a large strategic position, and its ultimate taking provided a huge, to put it mildly, motivating effect on the Greeks, knowing that once they took it, the Peloponnese would effectively be entirely free of Ottoman occupation. But like you mentioned, it didn't come without great tragedy and great loss. It was a month-long siege of the city. The city soon became scarce of food and of water, and Kolokotronis, who led the siege, while he did negotiate an end to it, Greek soldiers soon after broke through on September 23rd and overran the town and committed a massacre against, there's varying estimates, but anywhere between 10,000 and even higher estimates of 20,000 Ottoman Turks and Jews in the city. This created a lot of serious problems within the Greek leadership at that time. Many of the Greek leaders denounced what happened, and it did create strains within the leadership because they were fighting for a freer future for Greeks, and that kind of behavior, those atrocities, were unbecoming of what they hoped to see in a Greek future. So while, yes, it did provide a huge strategic victory, it was certainly one of the darkest days of the revolution.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to describe it, Tyler. And of course, trying to give fairness to all sides of things, and recognition of atrocities committed is important on either side. And obviously, something like this, where it had dramatic influence, it's important to bring up rather than to ignore, right? So, kind of thank you for enlightening on that a little bit. So that's fall of 1821. Early on, I think there's a lot of motivation, as you said, Tyler. There's a lot of momentum going in the Greeks' favor. But I want to fast forward a little bit into kind of the mid 1820s. And Alec, will kind of come to you for this. At a certain point in the war, the Ottomans really started to ask for help from Egypt in the form of Ibrahim Pasha and his involvement. So can you kind of describe that coming up, him arriving in Greece, what that led to, and kind of walk us through those series of events?
Yes. So guerrilla warfare was successful for the Greeks up to a point, but that was until they met Ibrahim Pasha's army, which was a well-trained, outnumbered army in comparison to the Greeks. Once the Ottoman Empire and their sultan recruited Egypt to help them, Pasha took it upon himself to, I guess, in a way, destroy and ransack all of Greece, leave nothing, barren land, if he could. So he actually had hoped to get to Greece much earlier in July 1824, but the fire ships in the Aegean actually delayed him about till February 1825, which was interesting enough. Now, Mani was not affected, luckily, by Pasha much. He attempted to attack Mani a few times, but was held back in certain places like Dervenakia and others, but he mostly went northwest and left waste from where he was at. Written accounts, especially when he was in Kythrias, which was where the Kythrias agreement was, Petru B. Mavro Michalis' home. Written accounts actually claim complete and utter destruction, roads and passes being inaccessible. After that, Pasha, as I said, journeyed to the north of the Peloponnese before he tried to travel back down and attack Mani once again. It was actually noted that when British officers that were helping Greece were exchanging prisoners of war, Pasha told one of the officers to let Petrobe know that he spared him the first time, but that next time he'll leave ruin to his region.
So, I mean, I think this marks a drastic momentum shift in the eyes of the Greek forces. There's aid being given on the Ottoman side, and the Greeks at that time still had yet to be helped out by the Greek powers. Although, as we'll discuss later, they had been asking since really 1822 for aid from the great powers, and it didn't come, at least not at this point in time. So you really see this marked momentum shift. And Alec take us then through where in 1825 take us then through 1825 leading up to 27 and the Battle of Navarino, where things kind of turned around.
Yes, initially you were right that foreign powers didn't aid us too well. We actually got the assistance of Lord Byron, but he fell ill and all the money he funded us never went to fruition for us. So it was a difficult time. Essentially, Greece was on its last leg at this time in the war. And the country decided to reach out to a diplomat from Greece known as Ioannis Kapodistrias. He was in Western Europe, I believe England at the time, and Kapodistrias was determined to give his homeland their freedom. So at this time, the Greeks are in a very, very tough state. He created the London Agreement with European powers of Russia, France, and England to help defend Greece from the Ottomans. And this protocol actually set up, which you mentioned, the decisive battle of Navarino, which was a naval battle between the European powers and the Ottomans, and notably as well the Egyptians who were running with the Ottomans. So in southwest Greece, the area where the Maniads first liberated Greece from the Ottomans, there was the coastal town of Navarino, and fleets from European powers were there to blockade to make sure that it was safe. However, Egyptian fleets came to advance, and the initial advice or initial orders from the European powers was to just blockade, stay pacifistic. However, when the fleets began to attack, they had nothing to do but respond to the provocation, and the naval battle was underway. So, as I said earlier, this proved to be one of the more decisive battles, probably the turning point for Greece in the Greek Revolution. The Ottoman and Egyptian fleets were destroyed by the French, and they got the message that Greece had help on its side. They had some very wealthy and strong European powers to help them and make sure that they get their freedom. They weren't alone essentially anymore. And this actually helped settle a deal with Greece. The European powers essentially twisted the Ottomans by the arm and said, you're going to have to make a deal with Greece, give up some land so they can actually start a country and start their civilizations again. You're going to have to cede some of your land. And eventually the Ottomans finally began to give up the cleft land. So as I said earlier, this fight was very important. The turning point in the entire war. It forced the Turks to cede independence, and eventually all the Peloponnese fell. And Notably, Mani never fell to the Ottomans or the Egyptian allies, and this was as close as it got, I would say. And the sheer number of men from the region, despite how much they fought, it goes to show, don't mess with Mani.
And I think that kind of really was the capstone for the military involvement. But I do want to discuss a good portion of, because I think it's an interesting topic, especially as the Sons of Pericles out of Washington, D.C., right? Governance, politics, you're in the heart of it all. So let's discuss Tyler, what did Greece's first government look like? How did they have governance in mind in the beginning of the revolution? While they were waging this war, clearly they had the governance of their people in mind as well. And what was the significance of that also?
Right. So, well, to answer your first few questions, the simple answer is the Messenian Senate. In the early days of the revolution, I believe it was right after they took Kalamata and they were in Messenia, they established the Messenian Senate. And I think it's hard to appreciate exactly what that was, though, without taking kind of a 30,000-foot view from this and thinking that at any time in history, it's very difficult to have any kind of substantive change towards independence solely militarily or solely politically. And we spent the first half of this presentation talking about militarily what the Greeks did to achieve their independence, but that could not have been done unless it was in tandem with a government to show that they were able to effectively govern themselves across a very, very diverse set of regions. And so the first establishment of this kind of government was the Messenian Senate. Now, unlike what we would think today of, a Senate, the upper body in Congress, for example, this Senate was both the legislating body and the executive. So this body, governed the day-to-day affairs of the region as they moved towards this ultimate goal of independence. And so that in itself is the first significance of what the Messenian Senate is. Secondly, they established and then proceeded to send around to several great power countries the Messenian Manifesto, which effectively was a notice to all other great powers, France, Britain, the United States, even Russia, even Italy, that Greece had declared war and uprising against the Ottomans, and that they sought to create, and I think that this is an interesting note, going back to, rewinding to the Orlov revolt, a Christian state, not an exclusively Orthodox state, because they didn't want it to be assumed by other great powers that they would simply fall into line and into the same sphere of influence as the Russians, but a Christian state. So everything in this manifesto was very, very specific and purposeful in the way that they wanted to present themselves to the rest of the great powers in the world as their own independent state in the Balkans, which, as history shows, is particularly tumultuous. So that was the significance of it, but surprisingly enough, this Senate only lasted a year before it was dissolved and absorbed into the greater Peloponnesian Senate. So think about it, you have Messenia in, if I'm remembering my geography correctly, southwest Peloponnesian Peninsula. And then as the Greek Revolution progressed, and the Greeks were ultimately able to push the Ottomans out of the Peloponnesian Peninsula, so too then grew their governing powers. So the Messenian Senate effectively turned into the Peloponnesian Senate to govern the affairs of all the Peloponnese. All these efforts were in fact led by Petrobe Mavromichalis. It was in May of 1821, I believe, that he did begin to invite all these representatives from around the Peloponnese to establish this government. I believe George is going to touch on this a bit later, but these were the precursors to the larger Greek national assemblies. I believe the next after that was the Second Greek National Assembly, which embodied a wider sphere of what at that time was turning into what we would see as modern Greece. So, again, I go back to the point, and all of this is significant because I don't believe that militarily, I'm not a historian, I'll say that. I don't believe, though, that maybe Greece would have the same success had they just been a ragtag group of soldiers, or not even ragtag, a group of just people focused on the military. They also recognized that hand in hand had to go the governance of it all. So it was a well-run, impressive operation. Again, I say especially given the diverse nature of Greece.
I think if nothing else, it kind of shows their intentions at the very least, that was something they recognized was something that needed to happen. In order for them to establish a Greek state, they needed to show that we are here to govern our people, and we will do so, because a lot of the reason for the revolution and revolt against the Ottoman Empire was the desire to self-govern. And so immediately we have this establishment of an independent government with a lot of rights being established that weren't established under the Ottoman Empire, which I know we'll touch on in the Constitution portion of it. But
one other thing too, I was going to say to that end, it was also very important in trying to garner the sympathies of other great powers. Mm-hmm. Because if they were to become effective and if they were going to be supported, again, they had to be an established body. And this didn't happen overnight. The Greek Revolution was a very, very long affair. And so over years, they established themselves as a legitimate government, which ultimately, I think, lent itself to getting the support of other great powers.
And I think we see this when the first, really Homeland Secretary for Greece, I believe in 1823, came into power. His immediate desire was a need for a Greek foreign policy, because he understood that for Greece to be taken seriously and to be recognized as an independent state, they had to have an established foreign policy that would promise the European powers, frankly, number one, that they could create order in what was a chaotic environment at the time, and number two, really probably more importantly, they could protect commercial interest in the region. Because as we said before, there was thriving maritime trade, there were a lot of exports coming out of the region, and if you can guarantee commercial interests to the great powers, they are going to be more likely to support those efforts. So I think we see all of those things come to fruition in these constant efforts to push forward some sort of government, establish these governing documents, and establish these policies that would really not only benefit Greece, but keep the status quo or benefit and grow the entire European continent and the entire Western Hemisphere. And I know, Tyler, it's interesting too. One thing I just want to add on, it wasn't just sent to these countries, it was printed in newspapers, which is kind of cool. You're talking about the Messenian Manifesto was printed in newspapers in Italy, France, UK, and all the way in America, which that was not the last time that something out of Greece was printed in American newspapers. Obviously, we see it today, but even we see foundations started around the genocide area of 1914 to 23, where the events in Greece and Ottoman Turkey and the massacre of Ottoman Greeks was printed in American newspapers, and it got American publicity. And this is kind of a precursor to that, in the first establishment of American publicity of the Greek cause, which then, of course, as we know and we'll discuss later in the year, led to pleas for John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and some of the founding fathers to help Greece, and we'll see how that turned out. But there really was a lot of influence in just what seems at the time to be a governing body of a small peninsula in the Eastern Mediterranean turned into this large, really holistic influence on the entire West. So, I mean, I know, Tyler, you were particularly intrigued by that. I share your intrigue in that establishment. And I think it's well described how you put it and what its significance was. George, then, so as Tyler alluded to, we have a little bit of progression. We have the Messenian Senate, which turned into the Peloponnesian Senate. In parallel at that time, though, you also had certain national assemblies that were being formed, various, I believe there were 5 in total, The first National Assembly, though, is where we see the real first provisional government of Greece and the first Hellenic Republic established. So, George, can you kind of walk us through what that National Assembly accomplished, what it entailed, and what its intentions were?
Yes. So the first National Assembly of 1822, or the first National Convention, a lot of great progress was made at this convention. Most importantly, the initial constitution was drafted, and the first prime minister, Mavrocordato, was also elected. So, as you both have talked about and alluded, for the Greeks have fought and beat back the Turks and won independence. Now it was a time to um, come together as the Greek people, form a governing body, form a legal document, and show the rest of the world that um, we fought against these oppressors that did A, B, and C to us, but we're going to ensure that we never do this to our own people. And some of these things included religious freedoms, the slavery being abolished, due process, equality, freedom, liberty, and it also established the executive and legislative branch. So we could also see sharp resemblances to the U.S. Constitution and the U.S. Revolution and many of the founding fathers, but also, the French Revolution and other revolutions that took place in a similar time period around the world.
And again, we'll see later in the year that that was not by coincidence. There were some connections there between American Philhellenes, American revolutions and French revolutions, and its effect on the Greek Revolution. So it certainly wasn't a coincidence that we see a lot of these common Western principles enacted. And we're talking in 1822, George, right? So this is 10 years before the establishment of the first Greek state, and 7 years before the first, before the borders were started to be drawn up, right? So this is early on. They're already thinking about this level of detail, which is, in my opinion, pretty impressive. So the last thing, I think we have a good encapsulating what was going on in so throughout the Greek Revolution. I'll ask each of you kind of a two-part question. First one being how did Mani, in summary, from your own perspective, how did Mani contribute? What was its greatest contribution to the Greek Revolution? And then, as a follow-up to that, what did the Greek Revolution contribute to the West? So in short, really, the title of our series, How Regions Won the Revolution. How did Mani win the revolution? Tyler, we'll start with you.
Well, two parts. I think it's important to note that being first is not necessarily always an easy feat. I think that there stood a lot to lose, and the actions that the Maniotes took, I think, really started the dominoes falling across the rest of Greece and instilled in a lot of people a collective confidence that they could take on the Ottomans. And that can't be underestimated. And I think the second, going back to my several minutes long rant about my excitement of the Messenian Senate, there's that. I think that was huge in establishing legitimacy in what they did.
Well said. Yeah, I agree. I think maybe we'll have to have a whole panel on just the Messenian Senate at this rate. Well, that's what you get when you have the DC Sons coming in, right? There's going to be a lot of interest in the politics and governance of it. So I don't blame you. I'm right there with you. Alec, what say you?
Thank you, Paul. I consider unity was one of the biggest things that helped win the revolution. My answer is sort of consistent with Tyler in that when people were together, it showed success. And Greece was mostly a fractured state with a bunch of city-states around until the revolution. Particularly, Mani was run by wealthy merchants. It had sort of a bandit economy, and they didn't really cooperate with other areas in Greece. So to be the first to mobilize and take advantage of a great situation, as you had mentioned earlier, and we discussed that Ottomans were leaving southwest Greece, they took it upon themselves to start the revolution a little earlier, taking advantage of the opportunities and unifying Greece as a whole, especially with the Philiki Eteria, on a consistent goal. It's what really helped Greece be successful. And that's how Mani won the revolution. They were the first ones to mobilize the people and the troops to fight. I feel that has importance for any culture, in terms that if you take advantage of the opportunity given to you, despite the timing, and you unify, you'll succeed in just about many facets.
So actually some good life lessons then that we can even use in modern day. I like it. Very, very well said. George?
I think Mani's diplomacy, not only with other parts of Greece, but also with other countries and fellow Hellenes across the world, really influenced how the Greek Revolution ended up going. But also, as mentioned before, it being the central powder keg or spark that kind of motivated all Greeks and other countries to get involved and stop the Turks. I would also say that diplomacy and Greece's history of trade and resources and interaction really were influential, not only before the Greek Revolution, during the Greek Revolution, but also afterwards and today.
Well said. So with that being said, I think we'll close it out in reverse order. So we'll start with George first. Just really quickly, I know you've all got these wonderful ritual backgrounds. Explain what they are for the audience, and maybe give any closing remarks you'd like to give just to close us out. So George.
Yes, I had the honor of having Mavro Michali at Areopoli behind me. And my closing remarks would be just find something you're passionate about. For the DC Suns, it's politics and Greek heritage, and put 110% into it and make things better for the next generation. And I just want to thank the panel, thank Paul for having me and giving me also a little history lesson that we could pass on.
Yeah, I think history influences us all, right? So I'm glad you guys could attend and make this. Alec?
Yes, Paul. My background is the flag of Mani, Niki Thanatos, victory or death. Always an interesting thing. A great words to move by, to sort of mobilize the troops with. My closing remarks would be, it's important to commemorate history, especially such a great feat like this, to go against the Ottomans at probably their best strength, just a couple people from city-states unifying together. It's important to remember all these people who fought for this freedom, and 200 years later, I would not like to forget about that. In fact, I'd like to celebrate and honor the people that fought for their lives to get this country back to a modern perspective. Thank you.
Thanks, Alec. How about you, Tyler?
Well, first, thank you for having me on the panel. I've enjoyed this very much. But my background is the seal of the Peloponnesian Senate. I think that this seal means a lot because it was the Peloponnesian Senate, from the Messenian Senate to the National Assembly of Greece, showed a government that was able to scale from just Messenia to all of Greece. And I think that, we can take a lesson today from the fact that Greece was extremely culturally, politically, and especially geographically diverse, not only in the Peloponnesian Peninsula, but across several different islands and in the mainland of Greece. And so if the Greeks were able to unify and get a government working together then, I think that us as a young Greek diaspora, with far more technological advancements, with a large and active and ready to become involved community, that I think we have a bright future ahead for a young group of people that wants to get together and keep this remembrance of a Greece alive.
Thanks, Tyler. So it sounds like all three of you are ready to get to work then, is what I'm hearing. I like to hear a lot of motivation, a lot of inspiration. The Hellenism is not dead. It's just thriving and beginning, and we're resurging it now with the young generation. I love to hear it. Thank you guys for participating, both in the Sons of Pericles organization and the Greece 200 initiative, and in particular this panel. I'd like to thank our audience for participating and viewing these panels. This concludes our How the Regions Won the Revolution series. We will, as we mentioned, be continuing our Greece 200 initiative throughout the year with other historical education topics. We also have our first of our cultural events, which will be in conjunction with National Hellenic Student Association, NHSA. It'll be November 19th, Holistic Hellenic Wellness. We will be in conjunction also with YAMAS. We will be talking about kind of mental health, mental wellness, and physical wellness, and how Hellenism and Hellenic culture can contribute and attribute to that. So please join us for that. Register. For those who haven't already, we encourage you to please subscribe to our Greece 200 YouTube channel, follow us on Facebook, like our pages, follow us on Instagram, and please keep up to date with all we're doing, and stay involved, stay active, stay engaged, and let's continue to honor our past by building our future. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. It's a pleasure.
All right, we're offline.